Hi everyone, how are you? My guess is you're a little bit stressed out because, frankly, our music history class has been a little paradoxical this year. Lectures and in-person lessons have been fairly slow, a lot of discussion, a lot of Q&A, not a lot of lecture. And meanwhile, our book has taken things at a breakneck pace. You have already been expected to understand a lot of complex ideas within music theory. You've been expected to read sheet music, to understand rhythms, to understand intervals, and to apply that thinking to the ancient world. There's no prerequisite for the class, which honestly I might speak to the dean about after this, because it's poorly designed. It's unfair to expect you guys to be able to do all this. So, the goal of this video and the videos that will follow it is to give you concise information so that you can do well in the class. Let's talk about what we're going to go over today. So, my goal is for you to be able to interact with music. There are a couple different ways I'm going to go about this. First off, I want to teach you how to read sheet music. That means I want you to be able to identify pitches and identify time from sheet music. Once you know that, you can interact with it. You can understand what it says, and you'll be better equipped to go into these lessons. Second off, I will be using an online piano since I don't know how to take a video of myself and edit it. And the purpose of the online piano is so that you can hear the music. Learning music out of a textbook is an absolute nightmare, and it is the antithesis of what music is, which is emotion and expression. You can't pick that up from a book, so I want you to be able to hear the things that we've talked about so far in class. Specifically today, we're going to go over the 7 natural notes, their names, and where to find them on the piano. What I'm nicknaming the 5 altered notes. That's a weird typo. I gotta fix that. Pretend that says altered, please. Thank you. I'll talk about the 5 altered notes, what they are, and how they relate to the white keys. Then I will talk about the intervals, or the spaces between notes, what they're called and how they're important. That one will be especially important because of a lot of how the Greeks understood music. I'll talk about the scales that are used to connect these intervals. And then in terms of time, I'll talk about time signatures and rhythms. Once you have pitches and once you have time down, we'll be able to talk about how to read sheet music. Today, I'll only be going over the treble clef because textbooks primarily focus on treble clef. I know that we'll eventually need the bass clef and grand staff. My guess is I'll put that into a video later, but right now I want to be focused. So let's start off with the natural notes. The natural notes are the white keys on the piano. And despite what it looks like here, there are only 7 of them. I know that for some of you who've never had a piano explained to them before, it can be intimidating. There are a lot of keys, but there's a fairly simple pattern for it that you'll see as soon as I turn on letter notes. So like I said, you'll see that A through G repeat. There is no H, and there aren't 88 different notes on the piano. There's a reason why all of these notes loop, and it'll occur to you as soon as I play a couple of these notes. As you can see, all of those notes sound the same. This is a phenomenon that's a result of how our brain interprets these different frequencies. And maybe I'll cover that if I get into like the psychology behind music, once I hit 5 million subscribers and everyone loves my channel. But meanwhile, as you can see, the reason why these note names repeat is because some notes sound the same as other notes. For example, here's a C and here's another C. There's a special name for this. It's called an octave, and for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to define octaves as 2 notes that sound the same, but are at higher or lower pitches from one another, rather than being the exact same note. For reference, since you haven't heard anything else yet, compare an octave of C to C and E. The way that our brain interprets frequencies, these 2 sound like very different, distinct notes, but these sound the same. So, we will come right back to the black keys, but I want to introduce them through a different concept. For now, we're going to talk about the spaces between notes, or intervals. You've heard some of the words used to describe intervals already, but you may not be familiar with them. The most important interval in music is the octave, what we just talked about. And back in Greek times, which we actually learned about, musicians created a bunch of different pathways to connect one octave to the next. These pathways are called scales. All a scale is a series of notes that connects one octave to the next. You can take a lot of different pathways, and some of them have different colors to them. We, in more simplistic terms, would call these emotions. For example, a major scale is stereotypically considered to be happy. And a minor scale is considered sad. Some of them start to become more emotionally nuanced, and we'll get into those a little bit later when we have to talk about modes. But for now, to focus back in on intervals. An interval is just a gap between notes. For example, C and G. That's a fairly big gap versus C and D. There are a bunch of different sizes of intervals, and the reason why I mentioned scales first is when you play a scale, each note in the scale is given a number. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 1 again, because it's the same note. When we talked about diatonic scales and a 7-note scale, 8 notes are played, but 2 of them, C and C, are the same. So it's considered a 7-note scale, which I know is weird, but just go with it, please. So each number inside of that scale has its own interval when you play it with C. It's pretty simple to understand, actually. Let's count up. 1, 2, 3, 4. If you play C and F, that's a perfect fourth. Oh, sorry, my bad. If you play C and its 6th note, that's a perfect 6th. If you play C and its 2nd note, that's a 2nd interval. Excuse me, I said perfect 6th. That should be major 6th. And we'll come back to that at a later date when we go into different scales and that kind of stuff. Now, there are also smaller intervals that we talked about a lot more in this last chapter. Those smaller intervals, as we see back here, have a couple different names, and those are semitones and whole tones, or half steps and whole steps. A semitone is the same thing as a half step, and a whole tone is the same thing as a whole step. Half step and whole step are more modern terms. Semitones and whole tones are more like 1600s lingo. So for now on, I'll only be using the terms half step and whole step for simplicity. The half step and whole step are the smallest intervals that you can do on a piano. The half step is one note, and it's not from C to D. It's from C to a black key. This is where we talk about the black keys. Black keys are like a halfway step between the proper letter notes. You see, a whole step connects C to its next whole note, D. But a half step only connects halfway, so we call this note C sharp. I know that sounds weird, but you can think of C sharp as like a 1/2 mark between C and D, if that makes sense. This actually becomes a strange concept with how it's written on sheet music, because each black key as a halfway point has 2 different names. Here's what I mean. Let's say you take C and you raise it a half step, that's C sharp. But if you take D and you drop it a half step, ignore what it says, this note can also be called D flat. A sharp is a note that's raised by a half step, and a flat is a note that's lowered by a half step. Over here in this notation software, You can see here we have C, and I'll talk about sheet music and how you can recognize it later. But this is C and C sharp. Then here's D and D flat. But you can hear that these are the same note. When two different notes share the same pitch, that's called an enharmonic interval. I know that's really weird, but my guess is that we will talk about it and you'll have to know it eventually, which is why I bring it up. So, to review what we've gone over so far, we have white keys and black keys. Both of them recycle after 7 white keys, or a grand total of 12 notes. The white keys are considered natural because they haven't been raised or lowered. The black keys are when a white key is raised or lowered by only a half step. Intervals are the spaces in between notes, and those interval numbers come from scales. That's a lot of information, I know, and if you want any more, clarification, please leave it in the comments or let me know. For now, I'm going to move on to my next step. Since I've gone over scales, now we're on to rhythms.